We're talking today with Mr. John Roblin of Waterford Township, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Okay. Mr. Roblin, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your own background? So where did you grow up? What did your family do? That kind of thing.
Well, I was born in Jackson, Michigan in 1924. And we were there during when the Depression started. My father worked for the Michigan Central Railroad in the shops in Jackson. And he was transferred to Chicago in 1931. And so the family, we moved to Chicago. And that's where I went to school and graduated from the 8th grade and went to high school in 1939.
And which high school did you go to?
To the Hirsch High School,
okay,
on the south side of Chicago. And I immediately joined the junior ROTC and completed the 4 years there. And when I was...
Why did you decide to join the junior ROTC?
Well, I had hoped to go to West Point. And my father had a friend who was a colonel in the Army, and he was going to try to get me into West Point. But the World War II broke out, and things all changed. The colonel disappeared. He was in units, and we lost contact with him. But I joined the ROTC because I'd always been interested in the service. And when I was started my junior year or I should say actually my senior year at Hirsch, I took an ASTP examination, Army Specialized Training. And when I graduated from Hirsch, I had obtained the cadet rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Battalion Commander. And after I graduated, I was called within a couple of weeks into the Army, which was on the 5th of July, 1944.
All right. Now, before we go there, let's go back a little bit to that period there. Now, you start out in the ROTC, was it 39 or 40? Or
39.
39. At that point, were you expecting America to wind up in a war, or were you paying any attention to what was happening around the world?
Yes, because one of my first duties in the ROTC on a weekend was to assist because they were registering for the draft everyone, including my father. So I was at the door at Hirsch High School escorting all of these people into this great big cafeteria room where they were registering, including my father. And then, of course, in 1940, they were calling units up, reservists and National Guard.
Okay. Was it still something of a surprise when Pearl Harbor happened?
Yes, it was. I didn't think the Japanese would attack us. We were more thinking that it was going to be a European war.
And were you paying attention to what was happening with Britain and the Atlantic and invasion of France and those kinds of things?
Oh, yes. And what was going on in Czechoslovakia and all of these things.
Were most of the kids that you were going to high school with, were they paying attention to this kind of thing too, or were the boys paying attention and thinking they might go to war? Or if they were out of the ROTC, did they not worry about it much?
No, they were all concerned. They were really concerned about it because the country was starting to go into war preparation, and they were, as they were drafting men, many of the students who were in school were getting part-time jobs. One of the students that I knew, I referred him to my dad, and he went to work helping as a clerk after schools and on weekends for the railroad because they lost so many people.
Okay. Then, let's get back. So then you graduated high school in 1943 then? Was that?
Yes.
Okay.
In June.
Okay. And so you described the process of then, at that point, did you immediately head off to officer training, or
no?
where did you go next?
When I was drafted, I immediately turned in my paperwork from the ASTP,
Right.
and I was sent to Fort McClellan, Alabama.
Okay. What sort of place was that?
It was a basic training camp in near Anniston.
Okay.
And I was stunned when I got there because I had never seen discrimination against the Afro-Americans as I saw in the South. And on the post, the Afro-Americans could ride on the buses, but when I went into town on a pass, I found that at the gate, the post gate, that there was discrimination, that the Afro-Americans had to sit in different seats. We couldn't sit together. And I went into Anniston because I wanted to find a tailor, because I wanted my field jacket sleeve shortened because I have short arms. And I found a tailor shop, and they were so busy they couldn't wait on me. And so I talked to the clerk, and she said, well, you just have to come back. And a voice from the rear said, send him in, I can take care of him. And I went in the back, and there was an Afro-American tailor. And he asked me what, and he said, you're from Chicago, aren't you? And I said, well, how did you know? He said, I could tell by your accent. He said, they really know how to treat black men in Chicago. And he took care of me.
How about that?
And that was, but after I finished basic training, which I believe was like 14 weeks, our unit was put on a train and sent to Fargo, North Dakota.
Okay. Before we go there, tell me a little bit about what kinds of things they had you do in basic training.
Well, basic training, we had drilling, of course, and we had rifle marksmanship was important. We learned how to use a bayonet. We learned how to read a map, how to do scouting and patrolling, how to cross a field, hit the ground and roll over. We also had some amphibious training, and I remember that well because we were on a small lake and they had a platform built over the water, and we lined up with a full field pack and our rifles and steel helmets, and we marched up 4 abreast, and then the sergeant would say jump, and we'd jump into the water. And what I remember most about that experience was the group before me, the one man said, but Sergeant, I can't swim. And the sergeant said to him, I didn't ask you if you could swim. When I say jump, you jump. And he did.
And what happened to him?
Well, he hit the water, and I was standing there waiting my turn, and they had boats, little small boats under the dock. They pulled out, and the field pack was heavy and rolled, but it was acted like a life jacket. And they pulled him up and put him in the boat. That was it. And when they said jumped, I jumped. The only bad thing about it is we had to walk back with wet boots to camp, and we had to clean our rifles because they were all wet. The only thing we took off was our gas masks. We didn't have to jump with those.
Okay. Now, was this during the summer that you were down there?
Yes.
So what was that like for a fellow from Chicago?
Very hot, very hot. And we had to take water pills, and it was something else. And well, the temperature would get up near 100. And we had a lot of field marches and bivouacs.
How much do you think your ROTC training helped you with the basic training?
Well, one of the things that helped me with is when they found out that I knew all the drills and could drill, they made me an acting platoon sergeant as a cadet. And so I didn't have to go on to KP, so I didn't have to, during basic training, experience KP duty.
Yeah. In general, how did the drill sergeants and so forth treat you?
Very well. They were interested because all of the men seemed to be higher intelligent. We had a higher IQ than the average draftee, and we learned quick. And the only thing we had problems with were the field marches. the stress of these kinds of things.
Okay. All right. Then can take us back here to you finished basic training and then you're heading.
Yes, we went to Fargo, North Dakota, to the North Dakota Agricultural College, and it was an engineering course. And of course, I had in high school had taken math courses because I took a college prep course. And so we started over with algebra and trigonometry and these kinds of things to bring us up. And this was going to have 18 months to cover 4 years of normal college. So we went to class all day, and then at night we went into study halls and studied to keep up. And during this period of time, we had an outbreak of chickenpox, and I contacted chickenpox, and they sent me, couldn't stay with my unit, so I had to go to a local hospital. And when I got out of the hospital, of course I had missed so much I couldn't make up the time there. So with a group that also had chickenpox, they put us on a train and shipped us to Iowa City to the University of Iowa, where I enrolled again and started over, and started with the same courses. And during that period of time, after a few months, the Army decided they would close down ASTP because they needed the soldiers. So they put.
When was this roughly?
This was in. Was
it early '44 by then?
It was in '44, and it was in the late winter.
Okay. And
they sent us to Camp Polk, Louisiana, and there we joined the 44th Infantry Division, and I was sent to in the 71st Infantry Regiment, Charlie Company, and one of the first things they did when I got to Charlie Company was thought I ought to be promoted, and they made me a private first class. Well, we were on maneuvers, and there were 3 divisions there, and it was typical Army division training, infantry training, attacking, simulated attacking, and bivouacking in the swampy areas, and it was something, especially with the snakes. I had never had contact with coral snakes or with some of the other poisonous water moccasins and so forth, which we had down there.
Were you training in swamp country or?
Well, it was marshy country, really marshy country. And we used to take our, when we'd get in a support area, we'd go into the local streams and take baths. And I remember at night, one of the first things I learned was if you pitched a tent to dig a snake ditch around your tent, because you might find copperheads and so forth in your tent, and we did. Well, after we finished the maneuvers, the 44th Division was sent to Camp Phillips, Kansas for advanced training. And while we were there, we experienced the heat because summer was approaching. And we did a lot of bivouacking. And the thing I learned there was that in Kansas, because there weren't very many trees and it would get very hot at night, or in the daytime, it would get cool at night. So you better, when you go into the field, roll a blanket, because if it got near 100 in the daytime, at night the temperature could be down, so you'd need that blanket. While I was there, they gave me a leave because they did most of the soldiers, and I went home. We were getting ready to go to a port of embarkation, and in the summer, in July, they sent us to Massachusetts to a port of embarkation. We had training.
Before we go there, let's go back again to Kansas for a little bit. You had said you were getting advanced training. What was your unit doing in Kansas that was different from what they had done in Louisiana?
It just seemed it was more concentrated with the training of the individuals. We did a lot of scouting and patrolling in Kansas, and that's when they had made me a second scout.
And what does that mean?
Well, when you make an attack, the scouts will lead, and they're advanced in front of the rest of the platoon and squads, and they would search out the enemy, and would, if they were making a patrol, would go back and relay to the officers information on the position of the enemy.
And so how did you wind up with that assignment?
I guess it was just fortunate. I think that the platoon sergeant either liked me or disliked me, decided he'd give me that duty. And I liked it. It was very interesting.
Okay, so now they've gotten you to Massachusetts, and you said they're giving you even further training there?
No, we were just processed, and we were sent to the port of Boston, and we boarded troop ships, and ours was one of the first country aboard the USS Monticello, which was a converted Italian luxury liner. And I can't remember the exact number, but there were several thousand of us aboard, our regiment plus other troops from the Army Corps. And we went out into the Atlantic Ocean and joined a convoy with escort carriers and even some cruisers and a lot of destroyers. And we went across in the convoy to Europe. And this was in late July, early August. And we took a long time because we were zigzagging, and there were destroyers dropping depth charges, and so we must have had, and we did all kinds of evacuation drills and had to wear life jackets all the time because of the enemy submarines that were in the area.
Did any of the ships in the convoy get hit, as far as you know?
As far as I know, they didn't, but I wasn't sure because the convoy was large and we couldn't see very much. And when action was taking place, we were down below deck. And our company was very fortunate because we did a lot of guard duty, which meant that we got 4 meals a day. And some of the other troops didn't. They got 2 meals. But food was very good, and I learned about the Navy because this was a Navy troop ship. That Wednesday is bean day, so you have beans for breakfast, beans for lunch, beans for supper.
Was the weather good in the summer trip?
Yes, it was very, very good coming over. And we thought we were going to land in England, but our convoy went to a place called Cherbourg, France. We were the first convoy to go directly to France. And they took us ashore on landing boats, and we went down with our equipment and barracks bags and full field packs. And as we were going to leave the ship, they passed out ammunition, which we were stunned at. I got a bandolier of M1 ammunition, and we went, it wasn't down on ropes, they had a wooden floating unloading platform dock, and we went into the landing crafts, went to Cherbourg, got onto trucks, and we drove on the trucks outside of a village called St. Mary Galice. And we were put into hedgerows, and we had to get into a certain area. Our advance company detail who had gone ahead of us had probed for mines, and they'd found some mines in the area, so we were confined to one small section for the first night the next day we all got out and probed for mines with our bayonets.
Okay. Did you know at the time what had happened at St. Mariglis on D-Day?
No,
Okay.
no, we had no knowledge, just that they had been fighting in Normandy,
Mm-hmm.
and we were stunned that there weren't any enemy in the area.
Mm-hmm.
We were given the ammunition because they said to be careful, there might be some stragglers.
Mm-hmm.
And we were pleased to find that the farm areas around there, that they had started to make cider.
Mm-hmm.
And we could go to these farmers with our canteens and get either sweet cider or the hard cider.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us wanted the sweet cider. It was, we were there when they had the election, 1944,
Mm-hmm.
and the men, I wasn't 21, so I couldn't vote, but
Mm-hmm.
many of the men went into pub tents and they, by absentee ballot, were
Mm-hmm.
voting.
Now, what condition was the French countryside in? How much?
Well, there was
Battle
a
damage, you
lot
see.
of damage by
Mhm.
shell fire and fighting. We saw many enemy and American vehicles that were on the side of the road
Mhm.
that were damaged. And after we'd spent quite a bit of time there, we got orders that we were going to be moved to the front. So they marched us to a railroad crossing,
Mhm.
and we got on boxcars, which we had learned were called 40 and 8s from World War I. 40 men or 8 horses
Mhm.
would go in the boxcars. And we went from Normandy to the outskirts of Paris, and we would stop in French towns, and the French civilians would come up and try to buy cigarettes from us, and they were interested in soap.
Mm-hmm.
So we would sell this, and one of the first expressions I learned in French was combien, how much? And we went from there, we continued on until we went up into the area of France, near Salzburg,
Mm-hmm.
in that area,
Well, there's
They call-
Strasbourg and there's Sarrebourg. They're two different
Yes.
places. They're both up in
they're
northeastern France.
both in that part of France. And I would have to think about what the name of the town was. I can't remember some of the places. It was towards Nancy and that. It was the Voyage Mountains.
Right. Okay, so probably Sarrebourg then, which is
Yeah,
more,
in that area.
sector. Okay, how did the French civilians treat you, or what impression did you have of them?
We at first we had no contact with
Mhm.
the French civilians, in that when we got off the troop train, we started to move forward,
Mm-hmm.
and we took reserve positions, and there weren't any Frenchmen in the
Mhm.
area because the forward positions were under enemy fire.
Mm-hmm.
And we fought in that area, and we were fighting against German troops that were the conventional Wehrmacht.
Mhm. Wehrmacht,
Against- And they had a lot of conscriptees with them, a
Mhm.
lot of Poles. And we had some men in our unit who could speak Polish. And at night and in the early morning, we would get Germans who wanted to surrender, and they would speak Polish. And it was fighting, and we did quite a bit of it, and it was typical, and of course it was a hilly country, and we had getting shelled a lot.
Okay. Do you remember sort of your first time in combat? What was sort of the first real contact you had with the enemy?
Yes, we were advancing across the field, pushing the enemy back, and they were retreating. And there were small arms fire, and we were hitting the ground and rolling over as we had been trained to do. And the enemy were just pulling back. They
Mhm.
weren't really we were attacking and they were retreating. And the thing I noticed was that when we advanced, that their artillery was not pulled by motor vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
They had a lot of horse-drawn
Right.
things at that point. And didn't see any enemy tanks.
Mm-hmm.
It was just infantry soldiers we were fighting in. And as time went in the fall, we continued to in defensive positions and so forth. We were pulled back, and in November we were going to make an attack, and our unit, that night we were going to go up and actually at a jumping off part
Mm-hmm.
in front of the defensive positions, and it had snowed.
Mm-hmm.
This was like on the night of November 12th. I remember it well. It was a Friday night, and we had that morning, we were up early, and there was a couple of inches of snow on the ground, and we had, making an advance march, went up through the defensive positions, and our tanks were there, and the artillery was firing and laying a barrage
Mm-hmm.
down, and we went in front along this towards, we were going to go up towards Strasbourg.
Mm-hmm.
That was the objective of
Right.
our division, and we advanced along and we were running into heavy enemy fire,
Mm-hmm.
and the word got around that we were fighting Panzer Grenadiers,
Mm-hmm.
not the type of soldiers we'd been fighting
Right.
prior to that time, and they were really firing on us. And being the second scout, I was leading, and fortunately the fire that they laid was in back of us.
Mm-hmm.
We hit the ground and started to give fire on the enemy, because
Mhm.
we could see the flashes from their weapons. And the first scout was wounded,
Mhm.
and we got to him and dragged him back, and we went into a little covered area where there was a small cover of woods,
Mm-hmm.
and we sat up in that area because the enemy started to come around on our back and our
Mhm.
flanks and were firing on us. And we lost contact because we were the lead company
Right.
with the rest of our battalion. And because I faced the back, I put my back up against a tree and drew my knees up
Mm-hmm.
and had my rifle ready to fire if I could see a flash. Because if I were laying down with the woods and everything,
Mhm.
I couldn't see too
Right.
much. But there was firing coming in, and all of a sudden we started to get shelled,
Mm-hmm.
and a shell landed not too far away, and I felt burning sensation when it was knocked down.
Mm-hmm.
I got a piece of shrapnel through my left knee, and at the same shell that went off, our platoon leader, the lieutenant got hit also, and we started to take casualties.
Mhm.
Some were from small arms, some from shell fire, and this was only around 10 o'clock or so
Right.
in the morning. And as time went on, we were concerned. We had an aid man, and he came
Mhm.
over and bandaged me up and stopped the bleeding. And the shrapnel entered above my knee and,
Mhm.
and exited below my knee, but the only wound I could see was the one below, and he bandaged that. Didn't realize it had entered above.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew I couldn't move.
Right.
And one of our men, as time went on in our platoon, there were only about 8 or 9 of us left that were able to function.
Mm-hmm.
He started to walk towards the rear, and the Germans started to fire on him and yelled at him. I couldn't hear what they yelled, but I could see he threw his arms up in the air and threw his rifle down, and we thought, oh gosh, he's going to surrender. But as he walked along, one of the fellows said, oh, he dropped in a drainage trench.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't even know it was there because of the snow.
Right.
And he disappeared. Well, several hours later, all hell broke loose. Shells were landing all around us, but not on us. and a big heavy patrol came up
Mhm.
with litter bearers.
Mhm.
He had gone to the rear because he was with them showing
Right.
me. And they hauled us back, put us on a jeep on a litter, took us back to a little French village, and I went into a farmhouse. It was an aid station,
Mhm.
and they bandaged me up. An ambulance came later and took me back to an evac hospital. There they discovered what the extent of the wound was, and I went up to a ward and woke up the next afternoon. The soldiers around me thought I hadn't slept in a couple of days, so.
Mhm.
And from there, they after a few days, they took us to a general hospital. Was there for Thanksgiving,
Mhm.
and I was in a room with two French Marines. They couldn't speak very much English.
Mhm.
I couldn't speak very much French, but I'd taken Spanish in high school, and them being Marines had been on the Mediterranean,
Mhm.
could speak very good French, or Italian, or
Spanish?
Spanish. Bingo, we
Mhm.
conversed. And while I was there, they gave me the Purple Heart and came and actually gave me the medal,
Mhm.
which I was able to send home to my parents. And as time went on, they decided they would evacuate us, and the Battle of the Bulge broke out.
Mhm.
So they wanted to make room in these hospitals for the casualties. So they took us in a hospital train to Paris,
Mhm.
and from Paris, after a few days, another hospital train to a French tent hospital up near Carentan.
Mhm.
And there I stayed for quite a long period of time. They put me in convalescence, and I had to learn how to walk again.
Mhm.
And I had a very bad limp. And after I'd been there a while, they profiled me and they were going to send me to a replacement pool. So we got on several of us in a French passenger train
Mhm.
and went to Paris, where we were picked up and processed and sent to outside of Paris to a ground force replacement pool.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to think of the name of the place. I think it was called Etomps.
Hey, Tom. Yeah, that's quite possible.
Etomps.
Mhm.
It's in my notes, but I lost my place. And at Etomps, I was processed, but because I was a Profile 4, they couldn't send me back to my infantry unit.
What does Profile 4 mean?
It means that you're Profile 1, you'd be ready for combat.
Mhm.
But Profile 4 is just about ready to be discharged from the
Mhm.
service because you are limited on your ability to function.
Right.
But they offered me a job as a supply clerk. They
Mhm.
were short at this replacement pool, and the job they offered me was not actually issuing the clothes, but actually sitting at a desk and processing the supply records for troops who were going back to their units, and they were giving issues of clothing, field packs, blankets, weapons. All of these things were done, but I actually worked in the office. And the sergeant in charge, who was a master sergeant, said if I would stay there, if they had a good assignment in another unit, they would give me first chance at it. And while we were there, we got fresh eggs once in a while, and I couldn't believe it.
Mhm.
Hadn't had eggs, and they also give us a pass into Paris.
Mhm.
And this was great because the first time I went to Paris, and I remember that there was a day pass and you'd come back at night. And we went into, several of us, we went to Paris, and the first thing we did was were contacted by the local little kids who directed us to the metro and told us how to, because they could start speaking English, how to get here and there. Went downtown and Champs-Élysées and did some shopping, and it was marvelous. And
was there much shopping that you could do in Paris at that point? I mean, were there
well,
things
we had
in stores?
cigarettes. I didn't smoke,
Mm-hmm.
so I bought my cigarettes at the PX, and I paid around $1 a carton for them. And I thought these Frenchmen were crazy because they would give you $3 a pack, $30 a carton in French francs, which you could buy money orders with. And I thought, oh, but you could swap cigarettes for French bread. You could go into a French cafe, and with the cigarettes you could swap for sandwiches and an omelet. And I thought this was great. Well, my mother had an aunt who had been a millinery buyer in Chicago, and she'd gone to Paris before the war and had bought perfume. And so my mother had told me the name of the perfume. She said, if you ever can get me a bottle, get it for me. So I went into a perfumery down on the Champs-Élysées, really exclusive shop.
Right.
And I'd seen this perfume, and I asked about it. And the clerk wouldn't have a thing to do with me. So there was other soldiers in this store, and I went outside and was standing there shaking my head and thinking about it. And one of the soldiers came out and he said, "Didn't you get your perfume?" And I said, "No." And the clerk told me she couldn't sell me any. He said, "You got any cigarettes?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "What kind have you got?" And I said, "Oh, I got a carton here of Lucky Strikes." He says, "Well, take one pack, go back and lay the pack on the counter." And he said, "And then talk shop with the gal." So I went in and laid the pack of cigarettes on the counter and told her what I wanted. She went and got me the perfume, and I paid her in French francs, put it in my pocket, and said, "Well, next time I get this wrapped, I'll send it home to my mother." So I was really pleased. Well, and I went, because we couldn't eat anything, we didn't have any unit to go to, so we went to the Red Cross had a donut dugout, so I went over there and got my coffee and donuts, and met a couple of soldiers, and we got talking, and they said, "Well, what we really ought to do is go to the Folies Bergère." So we found out where it was, and talked to the people in the Red Cross about how to get in and what time it started. So we went on the metro over to the closest metro station, found a cafe, went in there and drank some wine, got some French bread, went to the metro and got seats up in the balcony and sit to see and saw the Follies. Well, we didn't have any field glasses, but we found soldiers in there who'd come from the front who had field glasses, and even saw a couple of snipers who'd taken the scope off their rifles and were looking at the ladies down on the stage. Well, after that was over, we went back to the metro and went to the railroad station and got the train back to Etop, and went back to my unit. And by that time, it was getting close to morning and had to go back to work.
Right.
But sat at my desk and dozed. Well, as time went on, went into town and around there and saw the countryside, and still stayed and working in the supply room. Well, then an assignment came that spring, and it was with the Air Force. So that sounded good, because it was the Army Air Force, so we could be transferred. So I said, yes, I'll take a transfer, and they sent me to an Air Force replacement pool in Paris, processed, put me on a train, and sent me up to Reims, France.
Mm-hmm.
And outside of Reims, France, there was the 410th Bomb Group.
Okay. And what kind of aircraft did they have?
They had light bombers, attack bombers, and A-20s and A-26s. And I got there, and they processed us, and I remember my first thing that I had overnight was there were 4 of us, and we went to the mess hall. We were in headquarters squadron, and there were all kinds of different jobs in the headquarters squadron. There was a supply room, and then there was communications and all kinds of different things that they did, even ran the PX. And we went there the first morning before we'd had an assignment, and they had fresh eggs. And what I remember was that I only had eggs a couple of times since I left the States. And we stood in line because when you do your eggs, you go through the kitchen because they're frying the eggs or whatever. And the cook said, well, how many eggs do you want? We had our mess tray there. And first fellow in line said, how many can we have? Well, how many do you want? 2, 4, 6? So we all took 6 eggs. And the mess sergeant saw us sitting there at this table. And there weren't too many other people in the mess hall. So we came over to find out where we came from and so forth. And we told him we were from the infantry, the ground forces. And they had taken men out of their unit to take the place because to replace casualties. And he said, well, I'm going to love you guys. He says, you eat everything. Because the Air Force were complaining about the food, but we didn't complain. Well, they gave me a job as a supply clerk in the headquarters squadron. And I did all kinds of things because I was the only supply clerk. There was a supply sergeant, but they were happy to have me because they had all the weapons collected for the unit, and they had them in the in underground, which had been previously a German big bunker down there, and they had the weapons there, and they had Thompson submachine guns and every weapons, and nobody could clean them. They were happy to find out they had a man who could clean a Thompson submachine gun, the ones with the round drums and everything.
Right.
So I used to, when I were caught up with other work, I'd go down and clean a few. And I used to go into Reims, France, with the supply sergeant to pick up other supplies. And one day we were in there and we saw a building and we saw a German vehicle. And there were MPs around, but German officers got out and went into this room in this building. And we were back maybe a city block or two and wondered what in the world's going on. And then an Army staff car drove up, and with all kinds of guards around it, and there was a plaque on the front of it, and there were around 5 stars. And we said, what in the world is General Eisenhower doing there? Well, we didn't know. Went back to our unit, and a few days later, the war in Europe was over. Bingo. But before the war ended, the last few days, every bomber I'd watch them take off, were flying towards Germany. They were having the 1,000-plane raids on Germany. And the last day or so, our bombers were coming back. They couldn't drop their bombs because they didn't have enough gasoline to make the round trip because they were flying so far.
Right.
Well, it ended. So what they were going to do with us? They took our unit and the headquarters squadron and all the ground squadrons were sent to replacement pool outside of Paris, and the rest of the units, the flying ones, left, and we heard that they were flying back to the States. All going to be reassigned to the Far East, and that's what they were going to do with us. Oh boy, didn't know what was happening. Anyway, I'll make this short. I went through all kinds of replacement pools. They took me out because I had been a ground force and had been profiled and been wounded and so forth. So I ended up in Germany, 9th Air Force Service Command. They assigned me to target intelligence. And first thing they did, they promoted me to a corporal because they didn't want any private first class in this unit. It was very exclusive. And we were disarming German targets and shipping I wasn't in the field but just doing paperwork. And we were keeping the files on what we were sending, where we found the item, and what it was, and so forth.
Well, what kinds of things were you finding?
Jet aircraft, flak scopes, German flying suits, different specialty bombs, radar equipment, all of these things that were important. We were sending them to a place called Wright Airfield in Ohio in the United States. And while we were there, they were bringing back surplus items, and so I picked up a German flying suit, high altitude flying suit, as a souvenir, and sent it home. Also picked up a flak scope in a wooden box which had never been used, and it was for sighting enemy aircraft.
Right.
And they had different instruments on the side where you could get ratings for altitude and all these kinds of things in crosshairs. So I sent that home, and I kept it until a few months ago, and I have a son by the name of David Roblin who wanted would want it, and so I gave it to him. And he said he had a lot of fun with it last summer when he was on the beach, renting a cottage, watching the ships go by. But after all of these things, I got to be a specialist because in the unit they were starting to rotate people back to the States because the war was over, of course, and they were doing it on the basis of points. You got so many points for being in combat, so many for being overseas, so many for a battle star, so many for a medal, and all of these kinds of things. And people who had 80 points were going home and so forth. And I didn't have that many at the time. So anyway, I became one of the senior clerks as a corporal, and they were transferring our records to Frankfurt, Germany, and I was placed in charge of the records. I went down and learned how to drive an army truck, army 1.5-ton truck, and got a license, and I had been driving before, of course, but never an army truck, and they put me in charge of the records to take up to Frankenmuth, but
Frankfurt.
That's right. Excuse me, Frankfurt, Germany.
Right.
And I couldn't go by myself because these were classified records, and so an army captain had to go with me. But he wasn't in target intelligence, so he was just going to be with me, and so he had some officer friends in Wiesbaden, so on the way up we stopped at Wiesbaden and stayed overnight, and then we went on to Frankfurt, and we unloaded the records and opened the boxes and started to give them and explain to them the coding system of how they were filed and everything. And was doing all this to a colonel, and when we first went there, the colonel started to question the captain, and the captain said, I don't know a thing about it, Colonel. He said, you're going to have to ask Corporal Roblin. He's the expert on these records. So I explained the whole thing to him. and got a map out and showed them how to find the items based. And the colonel said, Corporal, he said, how would you like to be a master sergeant? I said, well, I'd sure like to be. And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, if you'll re-enlist, he said, I'll start promoting you. You can stay right here with the records. No, thank you, sir. I said, I want to go back to college, so I want to get out. So anyway, I went back to Erlangen, Germany, where this was, and in a month or so I got my orders. And
what impression did you have of Germany itself or the German people while you were there after the war?
Oh, they were so interested. We were in a barracks, and the barracks had been a German barracks, but they wanted to put steam heat in for us because winter was coming. And so they had a German engineering crew that worked there putting in furnaces and radiators and things like this. When the Germans were, they just had individual stoves in the rooms, but we had the equipment. And so I met one of these Germans, and he wanted to buy cigarettes from me. So I said, yeah, I'll sell them to you. Well, all he had was Reichmarks, which were no good, but we could buy things from the Germans with the Reichmarks. And I used to have my laundry. I'd take my laundry to a German laundry, and they'd press it and wash it and do everything, and they took Reichmarks plus a half a bar of GI soap. So I sold a carton of cigarettes to this German for $100 in Reichmarks. Ooh, I had a big wad of them. And all the time I was there, I'd go to town and I would have my laundry done and pay them in Reichmarks plus the soap. And we had Germans who worked for us in the offices, and they really liked us because we used to give them candy bars for their kids. And when we went to the a mess hall and ate, we would never throw we'd come out with our mess kits. We would never throw our garbage in we'd always let the Germans who were standing there, the civilians, take our whatever they wanted that we didn't eat because there was no food. And in the office we had several ex-German soldiers who spoke English who would work with us. And they thought we were just great people because we were so good to them. We gave them things. And there was deer season, and some of the members of our unit went out and shot deer. And the Germans who worked in the kitchens prepared the deer with field ranges, and we had a big party in our office building on the top floor. And in Firth, they'd opened up the brewery in Firth. And so we were able to get barrel beer, and we brought up several barrels of beer to serve with this venison. And the Germans who were cooking and so forth brought their families in with concertinas, and they entertained us. So it was a marvelous party we had. And then, of course, the next day there was beer left over, so during coffee break time, many of the soldiers would go upstairs for the beer. But when we had coffee break time, we all went over to the local Red Cross. They had a donut dugout on the post, and we would have, and I was there one time and met a friend who was from Manistee. And he was, I had known him and Bill Hansen, and so we started to meet. He was in an anti-aircraft unit, which was across the street, so Bill and I would meet every coffee break time that we could get away from our duties and have coffee together. Well, as time went on, it came time for me to rotate, and Bill had already rotated, and we got on going to get on the train to go back to the States, and I still had a big roll of marks left. I threw them on the table in the room, and we got on the train and left Erlangen for Belgium. We were going to leave from Antwerp, as we were going in this boxcar again, well, they only had straw on it, and they had put barrels of beer in some of the cars so that soldiers could have refreshment on this several-day trip. But as we went from from city to city, we'd go through the railroad station. I heard a voice from the boxcar behind me yelling out, "Wo ist der Bahnhof?" Where is the railroad station? And the little kids around the station would point to the railroads and say, "Das ist der Bahnhof," and he'd yell, "Nein, nein, nix ist der Bahnhof." No, that isn't. Well, anyway, we left. He did this all the way through Germany, and we got to Antwerp and were processed on a train, a boat, and got on a boat. Came back on the ship and landed in New York City, and then went into New Jersey into a processing camp. On a train, went through Chicago, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, processed, got on a train, discharged, got on a train to go back to Chicago, got into Union Station in Chicago. I'd call my parents and they were going to meet me. I was walking along towards the station, and I heard a voice from back. There were lots of soldiers on this civilian train. This voice yelled out, "Wo, das ist der Bahnhof! Das ist der Bahnhof!" And I turned around and saw that this was the same one who got on the train in Erlangen, Germany. Well, my folks took me home, and I went to, they were living in Chicago in an apartment where I'd been drafted from. Was there and decided I wanted to go to Michigan State University. But they were only, I'd heard by the grapevine, they were only taking people that were residents of Michigan, because there were so many getting in the program, the GI Bill of Rights. So I decided I'd go to Manistee, where my folks had built a retirement home, and I had my grandmother Hanson, my mother's mother, was there, and my aunts, and I had cousins, and so I went to Manistee and registered to vote and established my residence in Manistee.
So when was that?
This was in 1946, and early was in April because I got out of the service on the 23rd of February of 46, and it was in Manistee, and I met my buddy Bill Hanson, and I had gotten a job at the Century Boat Plant doing upholstery work on these Century boat motorboats. They were very popular with Chris Craft. That was a competitor in Manistee, is where they made them. And it was downtown. With Bill, and we were walking down the main street and decided we were going to go out to a roadhouse and have a drink or something out there and do some dancing. And there were some young ladies coming down the street, and Bill knew them, and he stopped and started talking. He introduced me to one of the girls, or all of them, but one of the girls in particular, and her name was Rosemary Chicky. And so this was very interesting, because I started to date Rosemary Chicky after that. And that fall I started at Michigan State and started in engineering, and had a very rough time with it. Under the GI Bill, I was living rented a room in East Lansing at a home, and it was hard to study, and having real trouble with some of the engineering courses, the pre's.
Okay, we're going to have to pause. Okay, you were saying when you got to Michigan State and started your engineering program, it was pretty difficult.
Yes, I had some real problems with the engineering courses, and so I decided I wanted to with the winter or spring term. I can't remember exactly which, but I think it was in the winter term I wanted to switch to business administration, and I went to the VA, Veterans Administration, to change. And they said, no, you have to take placement tests. And I started to take them, and I got into 40 hours or more of these tests. And they called me in and said, you don't have to take any more tests, John. We decided that if you put a Greek letter in front of the numbers, you don't understand what's going on. But if we put a dollar sign there, you understand perfectly. So I entered the School of Business Administration. And the next fall, I was getting $85 a month to live on with the GI Bill. And I thought, well, I found out that they had an advanced ROTC class, and that they would pay ration money, which was about $1.10 a day, which would give you another $30 a month. And that was big money. And I thought, well, heck, I'll join the advanced ROTC. So this was only a 2-year course, and then you'd get a commission. So I went in and applied for it, and they said, well, what branch of the Army do you want? Air Force, Quartermaster, Artillery, Armored? I said, I want the infantry. Heck, I'd been in junior ROTC infantry, World War II infantry. You know, I thought I won't have to study as hard. So I got into the infantry. And after 2 years, which as I recall would have been the spring, I think about April of 1949, I got a commission as a second lieutenant. And boy, that was great. My money was cut off. So when I went back on my senior year, I found out that there was a airborne battalion down in Lansing that was looking for company grade officers. They met once a week, and they gave you a day's pay.
Was this a guard unit or a reserve unit? Or just
Army Reserve. And so I signed up, and I went down and signed up and got I went to my meetings and got my $15 a meeting, and I was making big money. Graduated from Michigan State with a bachelor's degree in business administration in the end of May of 1950. And the week or so after I graduated, the Korean War broke out. Bingo. Well, I was going around to all of these various places trying to get a job, business administration. And I found out they were real interested in hiring me until they looked at my applications, because they asked the question, what is your Army Reserve status?
Right.
And here I am in the reserves, and an officer, and an infantry officer in the reserves. Well, we're very sorry, Mr. Roblin, but right now we can't hire you until we find out what your status is. So this was really upsetting me. So, you know, I didn't want to draw unemployment under the GI Bill. I wanted to work.
Now,
So-
were you married at this point?
No,
Okay.
no, I was single. And so anyway, what happened was I went to Detroit, was interviewing with General Motors. I thought, oh, this is for the birds. I went down to the reserve headquarters in Detroit and said, are you going to take me, or what are you going to do? Because if I'm not going to sit around like this, I want to sign up. So they said, fine, sign a category 3 and you can sign up. That's for 3 years of service. So they said, we'll be calling you for a physical and so forth. So, bingo, I went home and to Manistee, of course, up there, and stayed at my folks' retirement home because I had a lady friend that I wanted to see up there. And anyway, I took my physical and passed it, still waiting to be called. So I went back to Lansing and thought, well, maybe I can find something there. Got a job at Rio Motor. I went in to applied for a job because I knew they were hiring. They were making Army trucks. And after I filled out my application, the personnel officer called me in. He wasn't calling anybody else, but he wanted to talk to me. He said, why aren't you up in the salaried to apply for a salary job? And I told him about the trouble I was having. He said, I shouldn't do this, but I'm a reserve officer and I'm waiting for something to happen to me. He said, I'll give you a job out in the assembly line. So I got a job on the engine truck assembly line. Worked there, made big money, $2 an hour in those days, which was pretty good. Then I got my orders. Report for active duty. This was early November 9th, 1950. Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Put my car into storage up in the garage at my folks' retirement home in Manistee. Got a bus, went to Chicago, stayed with my folks. Got a train, ended up in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Signed to the 6th Armored Division. And I was assigned to the 231st Armored Infantry Battalion, and the 6th Armored Division was a basic training division. So we were giving infantry basic training. I was in Company C, and giving infantry basic to all of the draftees, and most of them were coming from the Chicago area. And got on the rifle, the team that taught rifle marksmanship, nomenclature of the weapon, and all of these things, and did other basic training things.
How did the training that you were giving these guys, was it the same kind of training you had when you entered the Army? Or was
Yes, the same, and there was nothing special about the training at all. It was just like the crossing an open field, hit the ground, roll over. The whole thing was in basic training with a bayonet, the same training that I had back in 1943. There was nothing different about it. No training for mountain warfare, no training for any of these kinds of things that were taking place in Korea. It was just the basic training. And because I was single, and there were a lot of married officers that were called back, they were getting weekend duty officer jobs. So I said, heck, I don't mind, I'm in no place to go here in Missouri, so I started taking their place. They put me on the duty roster in place of the other officers, so I did all kinds and learned all kinds of things. How to get emergency leaves for soldiers who had got telegrams from their family, they had a death in the family, and all of these things. Well, I became familiar, and I met a few of the officers of higher ranks, and I decided that now that I would apply for a leave, and it was in February of 1951, that this would be a good time for me to go to Manistee, because my lady friend there, Rosemary Chicky, we decided we would get married. So I went home on leave, and we were married, and brought her back to an apartment I had rented in Lebanon, Missouri. Before I'd gotten married, I rented the apartment so we'd have a place, a furnished apartment. So I brought her back with me, and got there and went back to Charlie Company in the battalion notified me that I'd been assigned a new duty in battalion, or actually artillery, artillery battalion headquarters, 231st, as the operations officer.
Okay.
Because the operation officer had gone to Korea. So I took over and did the training schedules and other things, and in the battalion headquarters. And as my other duties, they were looking for a assistant defense counsel. Well, I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd had a college degree, and I was a good friend of Captain Humphrey, who was an attorney, who was in our battalion, and he was the judge, worked as the judge for the special court martial, so I served at that post for quite a while.
What kinds of offenses or things did you have to do?
Almost 100% of our offenses were absent without leave. Soldiers would leave without a pass and so forth. And I remember you'd bring in the record. They were all guilty because they wouldn't charge them.
Yeah.
You bring in the morning report, they weren't present for first call in the morning. They didn't show up for all the formations, so they were absent without leave, and they were court-martialed. Well, we had a who commanded the regiment, colonel, and he didn't believe in confining anybody for being absent without leave. So he would only approve what the sentence was for a fine, but never would approve anything for confinement.
Right.
And so we always used to give confinement because it was traditional, 2 weeks in the stockade, or a month or whatever, 90 days, whatever. Now I remember one case we had where one of the soldiers in the battalion had, or the regiment had gone AWOL because his girlfriend was pregnant, and he was going to be the father, and he didn't want her to deliver the baby unless she was married. So he went absent without leave to marry the girl in Chicago, and he came back. They came back voluntary, and so he was charged for being AWOL. So we talked to the judge and Captain Humphrey about this. We had a long chat with him, and he explained the whole situation. And this particular soldier, if he'd have gone to the Red Cross, could have got an emergency leave to get married, but he didn't know this. He wasn't too well educated, but he was a very moral person in the sense that he wanted to be sure his wife, that the wife of his child, would be married. So we made a deal with Humphrey that he was convicted of guilty, but he was not fined. He was given 30 days in the stockade. And this soldier was brokenhearted. He says, "I'm going to go to jail." We said, "No, you're not. The colonel won't approve this." He says, "I don't believe you, sir. I don't believe you." So we took him over to the headquarters when we gave the findings to the adjutant, who took it into the colonel and brought it back and showed that he had approved the sentencing except for the confinement. There was no fine. So he just went back to his unit.
Right.
And he was pleased with us, but I remember that so well. Well, as time went on, with the at Fort Leonard Wood, the spring came, and by that time I'd had my 2 years of service as a second lieutenant. I got a promotion, and I was promoted to a first lieutenant. And actually that was in June that I got it was June 15th of 1951. And after I was promoted, I was on 11th of July 1951, I got my orders to report to Camp Stoneman Personnel Center at Pittsburgh, California, and to report there no later than August 18th for shipment to the Far East Command. And I had a 30-day leave, and Rosemary and I went back to Manistee for the leave, and then we went to Chicago and took a plane, civilian, and went to to San Francisco and Camp Stoneman, California, and was processed for shipment to Japan. And I thought at the time that I'd be going by ship, and I had told Rosemary that because I was an operation officer and had gotten rid of my infantry unit leader, MOS, which was a 1542, that I probably would stay in Japan, and I'd send for her and we could enjoy living in Japan. Well, on August 22nd of 51, I was transferred to Travis Air Base for processing to go to on a flight of aircraft to Japan. And when I got to Travis Air Base, I found that I was going to go on a chartered civilian transport, and it was with the California Eastern Airline. And when I got on the plane, I found out that there was only a few of us who were infantry officers. There were Air Force personnel and civilians who were going to be stationed in Japan. Well, we flew, and at first we've had a refueling stop in Hawaii, in Honolulu. We stayed there several hours and had a meal. Back on the plane, landed in Wake Island for another refueling stop.
Did you get a chance to look around at all?
Oh yeah, we on Wake Island we did. We walked around a little bit, and we drove to the place where we had our meal and took some pictures. And we were there about 4 hours. But we landed in Hawaii. We were only there at night, and all we did was stay in the civilian air terminal, and we had a very delicious meal there, civilian meal, not an army meal. And we landed in Tokyo, and they took us to a replacement headquarters company outside of Tokyo for processing. And I remember that night, because was at night when we got there. I was up at the desk by a sergeant, and he had my 201 file where that's all your orders and your classifications. And he was going through it, because the orders on the top of the 201 file had the orders with my MOS directing me there. And he was going through this with his thumb, and I said, "Sergeant, what are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for your MOS, sir, your military occupational specialty." I said, "It's on the first page." He said, "That isn't what I'm looking for." And he stopped. He said, "Here it is, 1542, and he had a big red stamp, and he went, bang. Got about 3 or 4 hours sleep, and it was dawn. They woke us up, started to process us as a 1542.
Which is?
Infantry Unit Leader. It's the same classification that anyone from a second lieutenant has to a major general who is an infantry division commander. Well, one of the things they did to us was took us out on a rifle range, and I test fired my M2 automatic carbine. Got processed next day, took us to the port of Yokohama, put us on a ship, and from there we went to Incheon, Korea. Went into Incheon, processed us, took us outside of Incheon by by truck and vehicle. I can't remember now what vehicle it was, to a replacement pool with the 24th Infantry Division outside of Yongdong-po, which is not too far from Seoul. Was processed there and sent to put in the 5th Regimental Combat Team, 5th Infantry Regiment, which was attached to the 24th Division as the 4th Regiment. And I was sent to Dog Company, which was a heavy weapons company, and assigned to the 75 millimeter recoilless rifle platoon. And during World War II we didn't have recoilless rifles, but these were part of it. And when I got to the platoon, I found out that the officer who was there was going to go, being rotated back to the States. They were pleased to find out that I had been trained in the ROTC with 75 millimeter recoil rifles. Most of the officers who were called back to active duty from World War II had no training with recoilless rifles.
What made the recoilless rifle different in terms of how you used it? Or
well, during World War II, a 75 was a cannon, and it was fired, you know, as an artillery piece.
Right.
But in the Korean War, they had in the Heavy Weapons Company one platoon of 2 75 millimeter recoilless rifles, which the cannon, which really is, would be put on a tripod for a water-cooled machine gun. It was a 4-man carry. They're very heavy, and they fired a shell that was a 75 millimeter cannon shell, 3 inches, and it was an explosive shell, and was for shrapnel. And it would blow a big hole in the ground, like just about as powerful as the 75 fired from a howitzer or
and
a
did
cannon.
you use this as
and you could fire direct fire, and you could aim it at a bunker, or you could fire it at men, or you could fire it indirect fire. If you were under fire yourself, you could be in defilade, that is, with some ridge in front of you, and with indirect fire techniques, you could fire on the enemy, just as you would artillery. And you had them near the front line, so most of the firing was direct fire. And there was no recoil, because the way the shell was constructed and the artillery piece, or the recoilless rifle, the twist, you couldn't stand behind it because you had a back blast.
Right.
But the rifling in the cannon barrel, or the rifle barrel, would spin the shell in a clockwise position, and the back blast would be counterclockwise. So if you hung the 75 millimeter recoilless rifle up on a high, well, I don't know what you'd call it, but even on a tree with a cable, and you pull the firing, the gun would very slowly move back and forth because of being recoilless. Now, in a rifle company, you had a weapons platoon, and in that platoon you had light machine guns, but you also had a 57 millimeter recoilless rifle, which was used in close combat. Well, I was assigned to Dog Company, and we made a few attacks, and I had experience of a lot of direct fire on the enemy in bunkers with directing the fire. Also had, because we were occupying, we'd move forward and occupying positions that had been occupied by the enemy, had experience with rats at night, because they didn't bury their dead like we did, but the rats would feast upon them. We made one big attack, and it was really a fierce attack with enemy, and when we were pulled back in the reserves, I got word that I was being transferred from Dog Company to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion. And because the officers in the C Company, this rifle company, had been, every officer had been wounded or killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was assigned the 3rd Platoon of Charlie Company and taken out in a Jeep to where the 3rd Platoon was in bivouac and pup tents, and found that there were only 10 or 12 men out of a possible 40 men in the platoon. And there was only one NCO, and he was a Corporal Arnold. And so the first thing I did is told Corporal Arnold that he was the acting platoon sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started in right away getting replacements and training, and found out that Sergeant Arnold, acting Sergeant Arnold, needed some training, so he and I worked together with how to do final protective lines for firing the Browning automatic rifles and setting up fields of fire, and showing him how to use a map, because he was very inept at map reading and things like this.
So how did he become a corporal in the first place?
Well, because of drilling, and he had been good in the States, and he was in the regular Army, not a draftee. He was regular Army, and he had just been a good soldier, and they promoted him.
About how old was he?
Oh, I think Sergeant Arnold was 19.
Okay, so he was not one of these World War II veterans. He was.
Oh no, he was
still a pretty new soldier.
Very new soldier, right? He had never been in combat,
Yeah.
except the combat that everybody was killed in, and he was good at close fighting in this type of fighting as a fighter.
Yeah. So how much training could you really give your unit? I mean, you were in a rear area somewhere? You were not.
We were in a rear area,
Okay.
yeah. But then we moved up on the hill, and on the hill is where you give them the training, getting in their fighting holes, and showing them where the enemy is, and saying, that's where you fire.
Okay. Now, for the most part, at this point, were the lines fairly static? I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
We were moving forward at that point. We were trying to move forward to straighten out getting the 38th parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And this was very, very important. And when I first started with Charlie Company, we were taking combat patrols out in the daytime, trying to get enemy, and we were, as I say, trying to straighten the line out. And we were, we'd be on the line for a couple of weeks, and then they'd pull us back off the line, and we'd be in reserve. And sometimes we'd be up for a month. And we were fighting in an area near Kumsan. And the enemy was in Kumsan, but they were above, Kumsan itself is above the 38th parallel, but the line, we were pushing forward in that area. And I remember that one time I had taken a patrol out, and had come back in the morning, and by the time we got back, headed towards our position on the main line of resistance, it must have been 9 o'clock or so in the morning, and a Jeep come tearing up the road. And this was just as they were going to cross the main line of resistance. And we went out and stopped the Jeep, and there was some signal corps officer enlisted men, and they were sightseeing.
Okay.
They said, we want to go to, we have a map and we want to go to Kumsan. And I said to them, you don't want to go to Kumsan, that's enemy territory. And I said, you want to get in the back. Just then a mortar shell landed close to us. So we all took cover, and they beat it to the back. Well, we went back to our units, and we continued, and the weather got bad, and we were back on the line, and it started to be winter.
Okay. Before we go there, when you're first up there in the line, you're starting to take the men on patrols. Can you describe what a sort of a typical type patrol action would be like?
Well, the thing is, you were given an area where you were to patrol, if you were to contact enemy, and these patrols were at night. And you would always have a scout dog with you, which which
Okay.
would lead off,
Mm-hmm.
and he could smell the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And you would go out in this area, and you would get to a point, and then you would take up defensive positions, hoping that an enemy patrol would come in.
Okay. About how many men would you normally take with you?
Normally a squad, a reinforced squad.
So 10 men?
So you were
something like
talking
that?
maybe anywhere with the dog and everything from 10 to 14 men.
Okay. And did you have any Korean soldiers with you?
Yes, we would always try to take one that could speak Korean.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so most of the time when you went out and did this, did anything happen or?
Most of the time, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
During this particular time, the patrols I took out, we never had contact
Mm-hmm.
with the enemy. We would have contact with the enemy when we were on the main line
Mm-hmm.
in defensive positions, and they would attack us at night.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do this quite frequently. And this was warm weather, and as we used to say laughingly, we could smell them coming,
Mm-hmm.
because they all wore gym shoes,
Mm-hmm.
and they all ate food that was laced with garlic,
Mm-hmm.
and it just seemed like you could smell them.
Mm-hmm.
The Koreans make a dish called kimchi, and this is something you could smell,
Right.
because it was so laced with garlic.
Mm-hmm.
And but these attacks at night, they were fierce,
Mm-hmm.
and we took very few casualties. But the enemy would have heavy casualties, and then we'd have to go out and get the bodies off because we'd get infested with rats.
Did the enemy, did they have artillery preparation and that kind of thing when they attacked, or did they just charge forward?
A lot of mortars, but not
Mhm.
too much artillery.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they opened up with artillery, we would counter,
Right.
and they would want to have something that was light that they could move.
Move, yeah.
Our artillery was fantastic. We had large guns behind us,
Mhm.
and as I say, in our 5th Regimental Combat Team, we had our own battalion of artillery.
Right.
We also had a tank company,
Mm-hmm.
and we were able with that to, and they would bring up half tracks with quad-mounted 50 caliber
Mhm.
machine guns, which could lay down tremendous
Right.
barrage of fire.
So then you were talking about, so you were dealing with that kind of thing periodically, and then it got to be winter, and then
We went up and dug in, and when we dug in, we would dig in, build big bunkers. That we'd have a bunker for every squad that we could have heat in,
Mm-hmm.
and that we could, out in front of them, we would have connecting trenches and fighting holes
Mm-hmm.
where we could set automatic weapons and the men could fire.
Mm-hmm.
And at night, the men would go back to the sleeping bunker and sleep where they had their sleeping bags. And then in the fighting holes, the men would take turns in crucial points along the front
Mm-hmm.
to watch for the enemy.
Right.
But things were, as it got real cold, and I'm talking sub-zero
Mhm.
temperatures, the enemy couldn't attack either, because what our problem was that the weapons wouldn't fire
Mm-hmm.
because because of the cold. The locking lugs would
Mhm.
jam.
Right.
If you didn't really clean the bolt on your weapon,
Mhm.
the firing pin would freeze.
Right.
And so things just didn't work so well.
Mm-hmm.
We used to, as I say, get in these holes, we would have stoves that would burn
Mm-hmm.
gasoline and fuel oil.
Mhm.
And we used to get maybe a 5-gallon can of fuel oil once a day for the stoves, and they
Mhm.
would use it at night to warm the bunker up.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get one, if you were on the main line of resistance, we would get one hot meal a day.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we would eat C rations. And we could heat those with little heaters, which
Mhm.
we had. The hot meal a day they would bring up. Some of the hills, they would have to bring it up with Korean
Mhm.
bearers. We used to
Right.
call them chogi bearers. In Korean, chogi meant to carry.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other hills, we had cable trolleys where you could put ammunition on this little carrier, or you could put food containers with thermal containers and bring the food up. When things settled down, we used to get our, in the units, we would get beer ration. Every man in our regiment would get a case of beer a month, would be their ration of beer. And officers, besides the beer ration, would get so many bottles of whiskey a month as a ration, which we, of course, we had to pay for all this. But no whiskey was allowed on the hill. That was an order. But the beer ration, they would bring up a can a day with the food ration, and the men would drink their food or their beer. When the sub-zero weather came, the problem they would have is that the beer, when they brought it up, would freeze, so they had to thaw it out before they could drink it. And we had a company commander who had a rule that he would bring up liquor, so that when a patrol went out and they came back in the cold weather, he would give them all a sip of one slug from the bottle of his whiskey. As time went on, it became my time to go on R&R to Japan, and that was a 5-day experience. And I was looking forward to this R&R to Japan because my wife's birthday was the 20th of December. And I had figured it out that when my time to go to Japan was, it was going to be overlap the 20th, and I'd be able to call her on the phone from Japan and talk to her and wish her a happy birthday. And the time was, as it approached, our company was assigned outpost line of resistance duty, which is in front of the main line of resistance. And because I was getting to be the senior platoon leader, there was 2 hills at the outpost line. One was a little forward and the other a little to the rear. And the forward hill was a larger hill to defend. The other back one was a smaller hill. So they gave me the smaller hill. So I took my platoon, reinforced with a squad of machine guns. And we were on the rear hill. Impossible while we were out there for me to go on R&R because there was no officer on this hill. And I was out on the hill, and it was cold, and I showed you that picture of Sergeant Arnold and myself. When we were on that hill, Sergeant Arnold by this time was made a master sergeant, platoon sergeant. And as time went on this hill, we were having trouble with the forward hill and our hill getting attacked at night by the Chinese. And things got a little quiet, and we were sending patrols out, ambush patrols in front of our positions, and scouting patrols to go around and look where the enemy was. And it became my turn to take a patrol out, and the patrol that I was to take out was going to be in front of the forward company positions. And at dark, we were going down one of the fingers of the hill, and we were going to cross over at the foot and go around. There were, as I recall, 5 or 6 fingers on this position, and come back in the morning on the other one. And we knew that on the far finger there were some enemy positions, so we knew we would reach them. And so that night, or early in the afternoon I should say, we left our hill. Before we left, they sent an officer to take my place from the rear, the company executive officer, who was really unhappy that he'd have to get into combat because he was in the rear taking care of company rear and all the problems they had. But we went over, took one of my squads and over there and met a dog handler with a dog, and we oriented, went out in the positions and forward in the company observation point, and saw just about where we were going to go. And then when night came, we went down the finger and started to cross over. And as we crossed over, about the third finger, we saw some enemy action. And we wouldn't be able to make the complete distance there. So I got on the radio and talked to the company commander, and we decided we would ambush the enemy position that was down in front of us, an enemy patrol. So we set up a field of fire with the automatic weapon we had, and our own rifles and automatic carbines, and we opened fire on the enemy, and then directed both mortar fire and artillery fire on them. And everything got quiet. We were almost out of ammunition, so we went back up a finger to our company positions. And it was getting way into the early morning hours of the night. And when reported to the company commander up there about the patrol, and of course we'd been in contact as with radio to the rear for directing mortar fire. Both, the weapons company had 81s, they were in back of us, and the 3.2s, the big ones, and then the bigger artillery. And the next morning I went back to my hill with the platoon. We got some rest and got a telephone call from the battalion commander, who was very pleased with the action on that night. It was the only action on the entire front because things had been quiet. And he said, we're really pleased. And so things settled down, and later on the next day I got a phone call from the rear telling me that my R&R was going to be approved. And I thought, boy, this is great. Thank goodness for this patrol. And the company commander had to call me and talk to me, and the company executive officer came back. He was very unhappy about the whole situation. But I got my stuff together and chogied back over the main line of resistance and back to the rear, and got a shower at the shower unit and was processed, and got on my way to make the trip onto R&R. Went back to Seoul and processed back in there in the division rear, and boarded a plane in Seoul and flew to Tokyo, and from there was processed at the air, issued a uniform, Class A uniform. Took my automatic carbine away from me, gave me receipts for all of my stuff, and got some money and went into Tokyo to the Prince Shimazu Hotel, which was made into a leave hotel. Was there for 5 days. And,
what condition was Tokyo in when you were there?
well, it was just like any other city. There was no bombing or anything. It was perfect. I didn't see any action from World War II. Went downtown they had a shuttle bus that you could go downtown, or you could take a cab. And of course, if you took a cab, it was quite expensive. It cost you $3 or $4 or $5 to take a cab, and it was almost free, I think, on the shuttle bus. And I went downtown Tokyo and did shopping, and they had an department store that they had converted into a big PX. And they had all kinds of Japanese things you could buy there. Fur coats, all kinds of things, perfume that came from other places, dishes, Japanese dishes, and on the Ginza they had these booths set up, and you could buy right directly from the Japanese there. But they had a restaurant in this big PX, and I remember going in there, and it was warm. The temperature when we left Korea was in the teens, and we got to Tokyo. The temperature was in the 60s, low 70s. Couldn't believe it. And so we went into. I was with other soldiers who were on R&R, and we went into this dining room in the PX, and we ordered our meals, and there was a couple extra seats at the table, and we all ordered milkshakes, hamburgers, and hot dogs. And a couple of Air Force officers came in after we placed our order and sat with us, and we were talking about this and that. And they brought our food, and he looked at it, and he said, "Oh my gosh," they'd ordered businessman's lunch. And because they were stationed downtown Tokyo in the headquarters. And he says, he looked at us and said, "What unit are you from?" So we said, "Well, we're on R&R from Korea." And then they started to ask us all kinds of questions. But I laughed when they how the expression on their face when they saw the milkshakes and all of us ordered afterwards hot fudge sundaes and banana splits, you know.
Well, was a businessman's lunch a Japanese businessman's lunch?
No, American. Everything was American style. And there were restaurants you could go to for Japanese style food. I didn't, however. I ate all my meals either at the meals were excellent at the Shimazu Hotel. And they had a barber shop, and they had a big post office where you could bring what you purchased, and they would ship it for you. And in this big PX, you buy an item, and they would wrap it for you. And they had postal inspectors so that they would give you a clearance on what you were sending, because certain things you couldn't send home, you know. And they had in the PX a camera shop. You could buy Japanese cameras, but they would run out, and some of the people would go down into Japanese stores and then have to pay the yen. And it was something else. Well, after my 5 days were up, the last thing I did was every person who went on leave to Japan, and by the way, before that, I meant to tell you on the 20th, I went and placed a call to Manistee, Michigan, to 23 McGill Street, to Rosemary Roblin. And they said, "I'm sorry, we can't place the call until tomorrow. The lines are all reserved." I said, "You can't do that." So I said, "Okay, the 21st is fine." So it was 10 o'clock at night on the 21st in Tokyo. They said, "Your call is placed." But you know, the international dateline. And it was the 20th. It's around 7 o'clock in the morning or earlier in Manistee. Phone was answered, and I heard the voice. It was Rosemary's brother, Neil, who hadn't gotten married, who was living at home. And he said, "We're calling this early in the morning." And they say, "This is Tokyo, Japan, or Rosemary." So Rosemary was the first one to wish her happy birthday. Well, then it was time for me to go back to Korea, and I did what everybody else did. Every enlisted man and officer was allowed to bring back 2 cases of whiskey if you were in the 5th. Some regiments you couldn't do this. But anyway, our regimental commander allowed it. But you had to turn the 2 cases of whiskey over to the supply sergeant. And you could only draw out one whiskey at a bottle at a time. But you could draw more than one bottle at a day. And you could sell your whiskey,
Mhm.
but he had a rule that anybody who sold their whiskey for more than $5 a fifth would be court-martialed. And a case of whiskey and would like Canadian Club
Mhm.
would cost you around, and you got 12 bottles,
Mhm.
of course, would run you around $16 to $18 a
Mhm.
case. So the $5 a case, he said, or a bottle
Mhm.
per bottle, would kind of reimburse you for the carrying.
Right.
Well, anyway, I brought mine back and turned it over, and they use with a whiskey for. I gave most of mine away to my
Mhm.
platoon. I'd go down to the platoon and when we were in reserve
Mhm.
and pass out a bottle, and they'd all drink out of the bottle. But got back to the company, and when we were back on the line a couple of more times, and all of a sudden I got thinking, well, you know, I'm getting near time when I should have a replacement.
Mhm.
And I showed you that picture, that one officer, and they said, John, your replacement's waiting for you, and they pulled our unit off the line. I went back, and there he was. And they said, you're being transferred to headquarters and headquarters company. So I moved over and was made the platoon leader for the Pioneer and Ammunition
Mhm.
platoon. We ran the battalion ammo dump. We also laid mines,
Mhm.
or pull mines up that we had laid. Also, in certain areas where the enemy would shell us, we had to clear the roads for unexploded shells,
Mhm.
things like this. Well, as I was getting oriented, they said that we were going to be, our whole regiment was going to be sent to the island of Koje-do,
Okay.
which is off the coast, not too far off the coast of Busan.
Okay. So southern end of Korea then.
Yes, and we were going to guard prisoners of war, because that's what they were doing, and we were going to relieve units of the 26th Infantry Division that were there. But they had to send an advance party,
Mhm.
so they were taking officers from the headquarters, battalion headquarter company, to put them in the advance party. So I was selected, so I flew down to Busan and crossed over on a landing craft and got into an area and joined a unit that we were going to relieve on the island of Koje-do. And there I met Captain Humphrey, who I'd served with at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, with the 6th Armored Division. He was a company commander, and we had chats and had a good time and got oriented to the post. And then our battalion came over, and my unit did a lot of work because we were fixing up units, buildings that hadn't been fixed up by the previous unit. There was an officer's mess that they had built with Korean prisoners of war and some Chinese. The Chinese were the best because they were unhappy with being there, and many of them surrendered, and we didn't have to worry about them escaping as much, and they liked the food. And anyway, they made me the club officer for the mess, and they wanted to open up the officers' clubs, start serving. We had a little beer, but we didn't have any whiskey, and our liquor ration hadn't come in, and we could get 7 bottles per officer per month, but there wasn't any, and so I decided there must be somewhere that they had some whiskey on the island. So I got my scouts out, and they said that the officers' mess for the general hospital on the island had a surplus of whiskey, so got in my Jeep, went over there and talked to their club officer, and they had a surplus of Harwood's, Canadian whiskey called Harwood's, which I'd never heard of before. And he said, I got 20 cases. He said, I'll sell it to you. But he says, you got to take all 20 cases because I can't use it. So I got the price together, and he was going to sell it to me at cost. I think it was $18 a case. So I went back, got my money together, and went back and got a truck and trucked in 18 cases of Harwood whiskey. We opened the club up, and I got one of my sergeants in the headquarters platoon to be the bartender. We had some pop we got from the PX and different kinds, Coke and 7-Up and things, and we had plenty of water, and we opened up the bar. I became very popular. They thought I was a great mess officer.
Did you ever discover why they didn't want Harwood's whiskey?
Never could figure it out because all the officers in our battalion liked it, and they preferred Canadian Club, of course. But, the Harwoods was great.
How long were you on that duty there?
We were there, I would say, nearly 2 months. And then we were pulled off, and while we were there, I got another R&R to Japan. Maybe it was a little longer than 2 months, but we were there, and it was the spring of 1952, and we were taken off and on LSTs, and it took us a night. We landed on one of the ports cities on the east coast of Korea, and then we were moved up to an area called the Punch Bowl of Korea and set up in defensive positions, because this was, at this time, the peace talks were in progress, and they were doing all kinds of things, trying to get things straightened around. And I guess the peace talks weren't in progress, but the line of the 38th parallel was established. And I was on there, and we did all kinds of things. Bringing ammunition up. I went to a class and we learned how to make a hush flare, which was to take a metal box that artillery shells came in that was about 3 feet long and about 2 feet wide and a couple feet high, and learned how to put a casing from a shell that they had, one individual shell, and fill it full of gasoline and open the tops, and then put napalm in the bottom of this metal box, hook up a trip phosphorus grenade, so when the enemy came up they would pull the pin on the phosphorus grenade, it would start the napalm burning, and the gasoline would start to hiss under pressure and go up in the air like a great big cigarette lighter and light up in front of your position. We were making those. But most of our time we spent taking off dud shells from the roads up there. And after I was there a while in the summer of 52, I got my orders to 52. Got my orders to go back to the States.
Okay, and at that point, my second tape is out.
God.
Okay, tell me a little bit about the prisoners themselves that you had to guard. There were Chinese and there were North Koreans among them. You talked some about the Chinese and how they acted and so forth. What about the North Koreans?
Well, the North Koreans were very difficult. The morning I landed with the advance party on Koje-do Island, they had just had a riot. The North Koreans in this one stockade had stormed the gate, and these stockades were surrounded by barbed wire in two different areas. They had the first fence, and then they had a space of maybe 15 to 20 feet and another fence, and they'd go in the air 15 to 20 feet high. And then they had a double gate entering the main part of the stockade. And we were told that the North Koreans had stormed the gate to try to break out. And this was a stockade that was near the port. So if they'd have broken out, they may have been able to get access to some type of boats or anything like that. And we were told, and actually saw this stockade, and there were soldiers lined up around the stockade, but they had told us that when they actually stormed the gate, the soldiers had fired and they had killed and wounded literally hundreds of North Korean prisoners who were trying to escape. Now with the Chinese, we had no problems with them. We used to use them. On the island, they didn't have the latrines were 55-gallon drums that were under wooden toilets. And these big, large drums had to be emptied, and we would use Chinese prisoners of war would come in with poles, and they had wires on these drums, and they would stick them through the wires and carry these drums way down to the where the ocean came. And when the tide was out, they would be emptied into the ocean floor, and then when the tide came in, the sewerage was washed away. And we would use also the Chinese to help construct things. Inside our area, we were building buildings to house mess halls, and we would use, along with our own soldiers, the Chinese, and they were very good workers and caused very few guards and never caused any trouble.
Okay. Now you've gotten in your story to the point where you finally get to leave active duty. Well, did you have to serve anywhere else first, or did you just get to go home at that point?
Well, I was relieved from the 5th Regimental Combat Team and sent to the rear for processing, and was placed on a ship with other soldiers to Sasebo, Japan, for redeployment back to the States.
Right.
And from Sasebo, Japan, we were there, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, for a period of time, and we had a ship come in, and we were aboard this Navy troop ship, and it was so much different from the troop ship I'd been on during World War II. The troop ship, I was in an officer's quarters on the upper deck, and there were 6 of us with bunks and clean white sheets, which I hadn't seen since I was on R&R to Japan. And they were all company grade officers, and we had very little troop duty. Most of it was troops were very easy to take care of. We had a hole where there were enlisted men. The officers' mess, we had 3 meals a day, and after the evening meal, they had movies in the officers' mess, and they were all new movies we'd never seen before. Following the movies, they put out a buffet for snacks, and then to bed. And it took us a long time, I think 19 days to come back. We're never seeing a seaport, just right straight back to San Francisco. And when we landed in San Francisco, we were taken to Camp Stoneman, California, where we were quickly processed and given orders for a 30-day leave. And my leave, of course, was to Manistee, and went into San Francisco, where I got plane reservations to fly to Chicago, and flew to Chicago and got off the plane and wanted to get on a bus to go to Manistee. And the bus, of course, from the airport, the only place the bus driver would take you would be down into the loop area, way downtown,
right,
to the bus headquarters. And he couldn't say. I asked him if he could stop at the Greyhound bus terminal. I said, "You must be going close by there." He said, "I can't take you there." He said, "You know the orders, I can't make any stops because of the law." Well, we got down near the terminal, and there was some road work being done, and they had to go right in front of it, and they stopped the bus because the bus driver said, "Get out!" So I to head and grabbed my stuff and got into the terminal, and got some bus tickets and reservations to go to Manistee. And the nearest point was Ludington, which is about 30 miles from Manistee. And got on the telephone and called Rosemary, and she said, "I'll meet you there." So when we got to Manistee, got off the bus, who was waiting for me right there but Rosemary. So we stayed in Ludington for a couple of days and then went on to Manistee. Spent my 30 days there and around, and got my orders while I was in Manistee to report to Fort Riley, Kansas, to the Army General School. So we, when my leave was up, we packed the car and went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and got a room in a motel, and looked around and found an apartment and rented the apartment, furnished apartment, and went out and reported for duty. And I was assigned to, first assignment was to Team F, and one of the posts near Fort Riley, to an officer's candidate school, and was made an instructor at the school, and taught basic map reading and scouting and patrolling and subjects that new officers would need to have. And most of my time was spent with map reading, because that was one of the things I did quite well. And had a little difficulty with the major who commanded the team. He was armored cavalry officer during World War II. Never had seen any combat because his unit had guarded an Army Corps in the rear. And he was always picking on us infantry officers. And so an opportunity came that fall to go to the intelligence school on the main post in Fort Riley. And so I applied and was accepted. And that October I started in the class, and that next year in '53 I had completed the course and started to teach in the school. My specialty was map reading again, but I did teach some of the intelligence courses. And what was an interesting thing about these courses was that we always were taught, because we had to learn how to teach. I had to go to that school before I even when I was in the OCS school, is that you always try to break the ice when you start a class. So you always try to find a story or a joke you could tell the class to get their attention. Breaks the ice. And I always remember this one story because they told us when I was teaching in the intelligence school, we had a big meeting of all the groups, the smaller classes, together, and this one officer was going to tell a story, and so that all the instructors should go to hear it. And what the story was that he started out, and there were different ranks. They were all officers in the class, from second lieutenants to full bird colonels, and from all branches of service. There were even some Navy personnel there. And I won't go into what the courses were in the intelligence school. I still think they're classified. Anyway, he started out, he said, I want to tell you about the Pope. And this Pope died and went to heaven. And he was met at the Golden Gate by St. Peter. And St. Peter ushered him up to a beautiful apartments. And oh, was it gorgeous, and beautiful music. And he had wonderful room service. The meals were spectacular. And the Pope was there for several days, and all of a sudden he heard a tremendous roar on the streets of heaven. And he went out on his balcony, looked down, and there was a big ticker tape parade on the streets of heaven on a big golden chariot. And people were yelling and screaming and clapping. And he looked down in this golden chariot, he saw an army colonel. And oh, everybody, as I say, was cheering, and this really hurt the feelings of the Pope. Went back and sat in his beautiful apartment, and he said, I'm going to go and see St. Peter. So he went to see St. Peter, and he said, St. Peter, he said, I just saw this big parade with this army colonel. And he said, I lived this religious life, and I did everything according to the religious rules. But he said, I didn't get any parade when I came to heaven. And he said, but this colonel, he gets this big parade. And the Pope, or the St. Peter looked at me and he said, Pope, he said, every Pope in history has made it to here to heaven. But this is the first army colonel we've ever had. The room broke down into laughter except for 4 colonels who were sitting in the front row. And we laughed afterwards because we said that captain's going to be very popular with those 4 students. Well, I taught all of these subjects specializing in map reading, and Rosemary really enjoyed living in Fort Riley in the apartment and coming out to the post and going to parties and meeting. And she said, you know, we ought to stay in the service if this is the way it is. I said, well, maybe we should. And I had signed up originally for a competitive tour, which hadn't started. And if you complete the competitive tour, you would be given a regular Army commission. So I was thinking about all this and about how we really like teaching and being at Fort Riley. The sergeant came in that morning and showed me a new Army regulation that came out. And it had a combat infantry badge in there. And as you know, you get a combat infantry badge without a star, and then you get a second award, they put a star on it. Well, this particular picture in this regulation showed a combat infantry badge with 4 stars for 4 wars. I went home that night and told Rosemary about it. She says, I think we ought to get out. So I decided I wouldn't enter a competitive tour. But as I was teaching these classes, one of the members in one of my classes, and I taught map reading at night, how to go at night, was my major friend from when I was in Team F, who really didn't care much for infantry officers. And he was coming through the school because he was going to be assigned, if he passed the courses, as permanent party to teach in the Army school, not in the intelligence, but in the one of the other schools. So he was really worried because he couldn't. Map reading was one of his tough subjects. So he told me that please make it sure I pass map reading. Well, I took him out on a map reading patrol, the groups, that one night. And who should get lost but this major? So I found him, got him back on track, and helped him find the coordinates at night with a Linzetti compass. He got back and completed and passed the course. And after that, he thanked me. And he stayed on as permanent party. Well, as time went on, the war in Korea ended. And the Army sent out a directive that any officer who wanted to be released from active duty could be released if they applied for it. And my category 3, my 3 years was going to be up on the 30th of November. But Rosemary was pregnant, and we wanted to get home so that the child could be born in Manistee, if possible. So I applied for a release from active duty as soon as I could, and the nearest date would be the 30th of September. So I applied, and the orders that came through that you could make this application ordered the commanding officers that they had to forward these orders approved. They couldn't they had no authority to disapprove. So my orders came back approved, and I was sent home and discharged. My discharge became effective the 30th of September, 1953. And before I left the post, my fellow officers told me that the economy was not too good at that time, and that I'd have a difficult time getting a job, and that there was no real reason why I should get out. I could stay in and become a regular officer. So I'm going home, and I got thinking about it, and I got to Manistee, and I had taken a civil service exam before I had got ordered back in the service as a liquor enforcement officer trainee. So I went back to decided I'd go to Lansing and see how that was up, and I'd also go to Rio Motors and see if they had any kind of a job opening for a salaried person. So the first thing I did is went to Rio Motors and asked them if they could hire me, and the personnel officer said, well, we're being taken over, we're going to close down, the war is over. And he said, if I were you, I'd get a job with the state of Michigan. He said, you don't have to worry about layoffs and all this other stuff. So I said, okay, but he said, I'll give you a job because under the rules I have to, under the laws that cover people called active duty. So anyway, I went over to civil service and talked to them, and they said, well, put your name back on the active register. And I was talking to this gal, and she said, well, I was just talking to Ivan Estes, the personnel officer for the Michigan Department of Mental Health. She said Ivan had told me they're looking for a management trainee at Northville State Hospital. She said, if I were you, I'd go up and talk to Mr. Estes. She said, it's up on the 3rd floor. So I went up on the 3rd floor, went to the Department of Mental Health, and talked to Ivan Estes, who was a graduate of Michigan State, who had served in the Army during World War II, had sympathetic feelings for people who were discharged from the service who needed a job, and said, the business executive, the manager from Northville State Hospital is coming in here tomorrow. Can you stay over and talk to him? Maybe he would like to have you as a management trainee. So I got on the telephone and call Rosemary and went and got a motel room. Next day met Joe Gill, and Joe Gill said, "I'd like to have you come down and see a state hospital if you've never seen one. We just opened up in 1950, and we're going to be 2,400 patients in the future. We've got about 800 now, and I'd like to have you speak to Dr. Brown, the medical superintendent." And so set up an appointment with him, and I went down and talked to him, got a tour of the hospital, talked to Dr. Brown, and he said, "You're going to be appointed." I hadn't taken the civil service exam, but they were going to let me take it later. And so I started to work, I think it was either the 14th or 17th of September 1953, or as the management trainee, and I learned the ropes and learned about state accounting and purchasing and all the procedures, the state purchasing division, the building division. And we were having construction going on at the hospital, and so I went to the meetings and met with members of the building division, met with them, and took the exam and passed it, and took the other exams and did other things and worked with the accountant and got a job then after I passed the exam as the administrative assistant to the business executive, and I was in charge of purchasing. And took some other exams as they came up, and Rosemary came down in December, not in December, but later. I rented an apartment in Wall Lake, and our oldest son James was born on the 19th of December of 53. And the Rosemary came down I think it was in February, and we lived in our apartment in Wall Lake, and as time went on, we decided we'd like to get a furnished apartment, so we got an apartment that we found a vacancy in Northville, city of Northville, on North Center Street, and it was a two-bedroom apartment, and so we bought furniture and refrigerator and stove, and moved into the apartment in Northville. And while we were there, Rosemary became, in a family way again, pregnant, and in 13 months after Jim was born, our daughter Roberta was born, and this was in January of 1955. And then as time went on, they built a children's hospital on the grounds at Northville, and they were looking for an administrative officer, a business manager, and my name came up, and I was given the job. And there was no medical superintendent because we were opening up from scratch, and the doctor who was going to be in charge was working at the University of Michigan. His name was Dr. Rubinovich. And so I interviewed with him, and he said fine, so I went over there in July or I guess it was earlier than that, maybe the late spring of 1956, and got the hospital, got furniture, and got it set up, and did all the things that administrative officers would do. Hired a plant engineer, and got maintenance staff in, and did the things. And Dr. Rubinovich came on the scene, and he, we got the accounting office set up, and we started to get ready to admit patients and everything. And he, in his office, he wanted some special furniture and things like this. And I said, well, he said, well, just go out and buy it. And I said, you can't. You have to. This is the state of Michigan. You have to go through the rules. You have a purchasing division. And he said, well, he said, you mean you can't just go out and buy things? I said, no. Here's the catalog. Pick out what you want. And if you can't see what you want in there, and you see something else, we'll have to go. But the state has a furniture factory in the prisons, and they manufacture things. Anyway, as time went on, we had real problems. And he and I didn't get along. Well, there was a vacancy I'd heard about. I went to Lansing and talked to him. I said, I got to get out of there. He wanted to get rid of me, too. They had a vacancy as the assistant business executive at Northville, not at Northville, but at Pontiac State Hospital. So I went and interviewed for a job over there with the manager and the superintendent and so forth. So in July of 1956, I transferred from Hawthorne Center to Pontiac State Hospital.
And was that where you made then?
And that's where I went in there as the assistant. And, as time went on, I passed various exams, became the finance officer, and did all kinds of things. And the man there wanted to go to he went back to school and got his master's degree in hospital administration. Took a job in Grand Rapids at the Veterans Hospital there that was run by the state. And when he left, I was appointed the administrative officer. And so I worked there until I retired in the 1st of January in 1983.
And at the risk of extending a 2.5-hour interview, one final question from me. Do you think that your military experience had a lot to do with giving you the skills you needed to go into some of these positions and work as this kind of administrator?
Yes, I do. I think what it did as I became an officer and in teaching I taught both officers and enlisted men in the Army General School. I learned how to communicate with people. I learned how to get up on my feet and talk to people. I learned how to deal with people of a higher rank than myself. But most importantly, I learned how to deal and direct with people at lower rank. To get along. One of the things I was successful with while at the hospital at Northville, my predecessor couldn't get along with the union. I had absolutely no problem getting along with the union because they used to come to my office and knew they could do this and ask me questions, and I'd tell them the truth. And even if, about how much money we had, how many we were going to have to lay off, and how we were going to do it. By communicating like this, I never had any trouble with union presidents or members, because you have to treat them as people, treat them as equals. Now, if I couldn't answer their question because it was confidential or classified, I would say, I can't answer your question now, because while I know the answer, I'm directed not to give you the answer. But as soon as I can, I will. And I would. That's all they needed to know.
All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today.
You're welcome. Was that what you wanted?
That was great.